The white walls of the private pediatric clinic seemed cold and lifeless, despite the warm lighting and expensive furnishings. Jamal Clark sat in a leather chair across from Dr. Samuel Wright's massive oak desk, squeezing his wife's hand so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Victoria stood frozen beside him like a wax figure, only occasionally blinking her tear-reddened eyes. Dr. Wright slowly removed his glasses and wiped them with a handkerchief, clearly delaying the inevitable moment. His gray temples glistened in the light of the desk lamp, and the deep wrinkles around his eyes spoke of years of experience dealing with the grief of parents. In his 45 years as chief medical officer, he had uttered these words too often, but each time they came with difficulty. "Mr. and Mrs. Clark," he began in a quiet but clear voice, "I've done everything I can. My team has been working around the clock for the past 24 hours. We've used all modern methods and brought in the best specialists from Cleveland and Columbus." Jamal felt his heart stop. He had owned a transportation logistics company for 12 years and was used to clear reports and concrete results. But now every word the doctor said sounded like a death sentence. "The infection turned out to be more aggressive than we initially thought," Wright continued. "David's body fought heroically, but the sepsis spread too quickly. We lost him this morning at 6:32. Silence hung in the office, broken only by the quiet hum of the air conditioner and the distant sounds of the hospital corridor. Victoria slowly released her husband's hand and covered her face with her palms. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. Jamal stared at the doctor, unable to comprehend what he had heard. The words seemed foreign, unrelated to his family. Just yesterday morning, he and David had been discussing plans for their summer vacation. The boy had been dreaming of a trip to the ocean. His 8-year-old son, so lively and curious, couldn't just disappear. "I understand how difficult this is, Doctor," Wright continued, leaning forward. "David was a special boy. Even in the most difficult moments, he smiled at the nurses and asked when he could go home to his parents." "No," Victoria whispered, shaking her head. "This can't be. We agreed on a new treatment. You said there was a chance." Jamal wrapped his arms around his wife's shoulders, feeling her whole body shake. His own voice caught in his throat. As a successful businessman, he was used to solving problems and finding ways out of the most difficult situations. But here he was, completely helpless. "We did everything humanly possible," the doctor repeated gently. "The infection was a rare form, resistant to most antibiotics. Even in the best clinics in the world, the result would have been the same." Victoria jumped up from her chair, almost knocking it over. "I want to see him," she said in a trembling voice. "Right now!" Dr. Wright nodded and rose from behind his desk. "Of course, the nurse will show you in. Take your time, you have all the time you need." The next hour passed in a blur. Jamal remembered his son's cold hand in his palm, the peaceful expression on his child's face, Victoria stroking the boy's dark curls and whispering something in his ear. He remembered the smell of hospital antiseptic and white sheets, but it all seemed unreal, like a bad dream. When they finally left the clinic, the sun was already setting. Jamal mechanically opened the door of his black Cadillac and helped his wife into the passenger seat. Victoria was silent all the way home, staring out the window with empty eyes. Their home in a respectable neighborhood of Columbus greeted them with silence. The 2-story red brick mansion, surrounded by a well-kept garden, had always been filled with children's laughter and joyful noise. Now it seemed like a museum, where every object was a reminder of their loss. Jamal helped his wife up to the bedroom, laid her on the bed, and covered her with a blanket. Victoria curled up and turned away toward the wall. He stood in the doorway for a moment, not knowing what to say, then quietly went down to the living room. His father was the first to call. Robert Clark heard the news in silence, only sighing heavily into the receiver. "I'll be there in an hour, son," he said in a hoarse voice. "Hang in there." The next calls were even harder. Victoria's mother, Dorothy Evans, was so distraught that she could barely get out that she was coming over immediately. His wife's parents lived in a neighboring town, and Jamal knew they would be there before dark. Then he dialed Tyrone Hill's number. His best friend from college was not only his business partner, but also David's godfather. When Tyrone heard the news, there was a long silence on the line. Jesus, Jay, he finally whispered. I'm on my way. Don't bother, Ty. There'll be a lot to do with the funeral tomorrow. What the hell are you talking about? I'll be there in 20 minutes. Jamal didn't argue. He knew Tyrone would come anyway, regardless of what he said. That was the kind of man he was, always there when you needed him, especially in tough times. His father arrived first, as promised. At 62, Robert Clark was still a strong man with gray stubble and attentive eyes. He had founded the family real estate business, where Jamal had started out before switching to logistics. The old man hugged his son silently, and Jamal felt he could finally allow himself to show his weakness. How's Victoria? His father asked quietly. It's tough. She's upstairs, doesn't want to talk to anyone. Robert nodded and went into the kitchen to make coffee. He had always believed that in difficult times it was important to take care of the simple, everyday things. Victoria's parents arrived half an hour later. Dorothy Evans, an elegant woman of 58, burst into tears as soon as she crossed the threshold. Her husband, Walter, the owner of a small chain of stationery stores, looked distraught and aged. They immediately went upstairs to their daughter. Tyrone was the last to arrive, when the whole family had already gathered in the house. He was a tall man with an athletic build, always dressed expensively and tastefully. His chain of car dealerships was thriving, and many considered him one of the most successful young entrepreneurs in the city. But now his usual confidence was gone. Jay, he said, hugging his friend tightly, I'm so sorry. David was a wonderful boy. I know, Jamal replied, feeling a lump in his throat again. He loved going with you to look at new cars. Tyrone nodded silently and sat down next to Robert on the sofa. What about the funeral? He asked after a while. Nothing has been decided yet. We'll have to organize everything tomorrow. I'll take care of it, Tyrone said decisively. I have connections at the best funeral home in town. David deserves the best send-off. Jamal wanted to object, but his father shook his head. Let Tyrone help, son. You don't need to worry about the arrangements right now. I'll take care of everything, Tyrone continued. Flowers, music, orchestra. Do you want an open or closed ceremony? Open, Jamal said quietly. David was known by many, his teachers, classmates, coaches from the sports club. All right, I'll arrange for the Baptist church on Main Street. They have a large hall, and I'll hire the best pastor. The evening dragged on agonizingly. Relatives tried to keep the conversation going, sharing memories of David, but every word caused pain. Victoria never came down for dinner, and her mother brought her plate upstairs. Around 10 o'clock, the guests began to leave. Dorothy and Walter decided to stay the night to be with their daughter. Robert stayed too, settling into an armchair in the living room. Tyrone lingered until last. Jay, if you need anything, call me anytime, he said, standing in the doorway. Day or night, it doesn't matter. I'll drop everything and come. Thanks, Ty. You're a true friend. David was like a son to me. Tyrone's voice faltered. I'll do everything I can to give him a proper send-off. When the house was finally empty, Jamal went up to the bedroom. Victoria was lying on her side, staring into the darkness. He lay down carefully beside her, not sure if he should hug her. How are we going to live now? She whispered into the darkness. I don't know, he replied honestly, but we'll manage, together. She turned toward him and pressed her face against his chest. They lay there in silence, listening to the night wind rustling the treetops outside the window. For the first time in 8 years, their home felt empty and unfamiliar. The Baptist church on Main Street had never seen so many people. Tyrone had kept his word and organized everything perfectly. White lilies and roses adorned the altar, and a small white coffin was buried in a sea of flowers. Jamal sat in the front row, holding Victoria's arm, who could barely stand. Her black dress made her skin look pale as chalk, and her eyes were red from crying. Pastor Daniel Foster, a gray-haired man with a kind face whom Tyrone had specially invited from a neighboring town, spoke about how a short life can leave a deep mark on people's hearts. His voice echoed through the high arches of the church, but Jamal hardly listened to the words. He stared at the small coffin and couldn't believe that his son was lying there. The hall was overflowing. In the front rows sat relatives, Jamal and Victoria's parents, aunts and uncles, cousins. Behind them sat colleagues and business partners. Jamal recognized the faces of executives from large logistics companies he had worked with, owners of car dealerships from the Torona chain, and lawyers from Victoria's firm. Even the mayor of the city had found time to come and offer his condolences. David's teacher, Mrs. Caroline Brown, sat with the boys' classmates and their parents. Many children were crying, not fully understanding what had happened. Baseball coach Michael Sanders, a strong man in his 40s, wiped his eyes with a handkerchief. David was one of the best players on the team, despite his young age. Tyrone sat in the second row next to Jamal's father. His face was serious and focused, and he nodded periodically to the pastor and glanced at his friend with sympathy. He was wearing a perfectly tailored black suit from an expensive tailor, a white shirt, and a black tie. Even at a time like this, he looked impeccable, as always. David Clark lived only 8 years, said Pastor Foster. But in those years, he brought joy to everyone who knew him. His teachers describe him as an inquisitive and kind boy. His friends remember his laughter and his willingness to help. And to his parents, he was the center of their universe, the meaning of their lives. Victoria squeezed her husband's hand so tightly that her nails dug into his skin. Jamal put his arm around her shoulders, feeling her tremble with suppressed sobs. "We don't understand why God takes children so early," the pastor continued. "But we believe that David is now in a better place, where there is no pain or suffering, where he can run and play tirelessly." After the ceremony, the procession moved to Green Hill Cemetery. The long line of black cars stretched for almost a mile. Jamal didn't remember the way there. It was all like a dream. All he remembered was the grave, the coffin being lowered, and the handful of dirt he threw after his son. Tyrone approached him as the cemetery ceremony was coming to an end. "Jay, everything's ready at your place," he said quietly. "The catering service has set the tables. You can receive guests." Jamal nodded, unable to speak. Tyrone had really thought of everything. Just yesterday, he had arrived at their home with a team of organizers who had transformed their mansion into a place for a wake. The living room, dining room, and veranda had been prepared for a large number of people. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the Clark's house was filled with people. Jamal stood at the entrance to the living room accepting condolences. Every handshake, every sympathetic word required enormous effort on his part, but he held on. Victoria sat in an armchair by the window, her mother constantly by her side. "My deepest condolences, Jamal," said Richard Miller, owner of the largest trucking company in the state. "David was a wonderful boy. I remember him coming to your office and asking about our trucks." "Thank you, Rick. He really loved big machines. If you need time to recover, don't hesitate to let us know. Our contract can wait." Next to step forward was Judge William Harris, an old friend of the family. "Jamal, Victoria, please accept my sincere condolences. The loss of a child is the worst thing that can happen to parents." "Thank you for coming, Your Honor," Jamal replied. "David was a special boy. The last time I saw him at Tyrone's barbecue, he told me about his plans to become a lawyer like his mother." Jamal smiled involuntarily, remembering that conversation. David had explained seriously to the judge that he would defend innocent people and put bad people in jail. The guests gradually dispersed throughout the house. The living room was filled mainly with business partners and colleagues, discussing the latest business news in hushed voices. Family friends and neighbors gathered in the dining room. Relatives with children settled on the veranda. Tyrone was everywhere at once. He made sure everyone had food and drinks, introduced people who didn't know each other, and took care of minor organizational issues. Jamal caught his eye several times and nodded his thanks. Without his friend's help, he would not have been able to handle so many guests. "Ty did an incredible job," his father said, approaching his son. "Everything is organized to the highest standard." "Yes, he's a true friend," Jamal agreed. "I don't know what we would have done without him." By 6 o'clock, the memorial service was in full swing. The house was full of people. Guests gathered in small groups and talked about David, sharing memories. Muffled conversations could be heard in the living room, dining room, and on the porch. He went upstairs to wash up and tidy himself up. In the bathroom, he stared at his reflection in the mirror for a long time. His face was gaunt. Dark circles had formed under his eyes, and the gray strands in his hair were more noticeable. In 2 days, He had aged several years. As he left the bathroom, Jamal heard voices coming from his study. The door was ajar, and he recognized his wife's voice. She was talking to someone quietly, almost in a whisper. Jamal wanted to walk past, not wanting to disturb them, but one phrase made him stop. "Now I'm free," Victoria said. Jamal froze in the hallway. What did she mean? Free from what? "Are you sure this is the right time for this?" replied a male voice, and Jamal was surprised to recognize it as Tyrone's. "When else?" Victoria's voice sounded tired, but there was a new tone to it. "Jamal is in mourning. He doesn't notice anything. David no longer binds us. We can be together." Jamal's heart stopped. He couldn't believe his ears. Was Victoria talking about their son as if he were an obstacle? "Vic, please!" Tyrone's voice sounded alarmed. "This isn't the right time. We agreed to wait." "Wait for what?" His wife's voice was impatient. "We've been hiding our relationship for a year and a half. I'm tired of lying and pretending. David was the only reason I stayed with Jamal." Jamal felt the floor slip away beneath his feet. A year and a half? They had been dating for a year and a half, and he hadn't suspected a thing. His best friend and his wife. "He's a good man, Vic. He doesn't deserve to be betrayed like this." "You said you loved me." Victoria's voice softened. "That you'd do anything for our relationship. What changed?" "Nothing has changed in my feelings for you. But Jamal is my best friend. We've known each other since college. He trusted me with his son, his business, his family. So what? You want us to meet in secret for the rest of our lives? Book hotel rooms like teenagers? I'm tired of this, Ty." Jamal leaned against the wall, feeling his legs buckle. His head was ringing with emptiness. All that time while he was working, building his business, taking care of his family, his wife was seeing his best friend. Tyrone, whom he trusted more than anyone else in the world, who was David's godfather, had betrayed him in the most despicable way. "Let's talk about this later," Tyrone said. "Now is not the time or place." "When then? When the mourning is over? In a month? A year? Maybe never." "Victoria, please understand. Jamal just buried his son. Give him time to recover." "And then what? You think he'll just let me go? Jamal is possessive. He'll never give me a divorce without a fight. But right now, he's broken. He won't put up a fight." There was a cold calculation in his wife's voice that Jamal had never heard before. She spoke of him as an obstacle to be overcome, of their marriage as a business transaction. "I'm filing for divorce in a week," Victoria continued. "I'll say we need time apart to get over our grief. He won't argue with that in his state." "Vic, listen to yourself. That sounds awful." "Awful? What's awful about two grown people wanting to be together? We love each other, Ty. Isn't that more important than anything else?" "It is, but—" "No buts. Either you're ready to be open with me, or we're done right now." The office was silent. Jamal could hear only the beating of his own heart. He felt anger slowly rising from the depths of his soul, drowning out the pain and shock. "Okay," Tyrone finally said. "But let's at least wait until the end of the week. Let people forget about the funeral." "Agreed," Victoria said with satisfaction in her voice. "In the meantime, we can spend time together. Jamal isn't paying any attention to me anyway." Jamal heard the rustle of clothing and realized they were embracing. His wife was hugging his best friend on the day of their son's funeral, planning a divorce and a new life. At a time when he needed her support the most, she was thinking only of herself. He quietly moved away from the door and went down to the living room. His legs were shaking, and blood was pounding in his temples. Everything around him looked different. These people, these conversations, the whole house. It was as if the whole world had changed in a matter of minutes. "Are you okay, son?" His father approached him with a worried look. "You look very pale." "I'm fine," Jamal muttered. "Just tired." "Of course you're tired. It's been a long day. Maybe you should get some rest?" Jamal shook his head. He couldn't be alone with his thoughts right now. It was better to be around people, to pretend that everything was fine. Tyrone and Victoria came downstairs a few minutes later. His wife looked calmer than she had all day, and there was even a faint blush on her cheeks. Tyrone tried not to look at Jamal and kept busy with the remaining guests. "How are you, dear?" Victoria approached her husband and took his arm. Jamal looked at her and saw a completely different woman. The same appearance, the same voice, but behind them was something strange and cold. How could he not have noticed it before? "Fine," he replied curtly. "Maybe I should see the remaining guests out? You look exhausted." "No, I'll be fine." The next few minutes dragged on agonizingly. Jamal watched as Tyrone and Victoria came downstairs and mingled with the guests again, pretending nothing had happened. His wife looked calmer than she had all day, and there was even a faint blush on her cheeks. Tyrone tried not to look at Jamal, keeping himself busy with the guests. There were still many people in the house. Business partners and colleagues were talking in the living room. Family, friends, and neighbors had gathered in the dining room, and relatives with children remained on the veranda. The memorial service continued. People ate, drank, and remembered David. Jamal automatically joined in the conversations, nodding in response to words of sympathy. Inside, he was burning with rage and pain, but on the outside, he tried to remain calm. Tyrone came up to him from time to time, asking how he was doing and offering his help. Every word he said now seemed false. After a while, Jamal felt he couldn't stand being around all these people anymore. He needed to be alone to process what he had heard. He quietly went upstairs to his bedroom, telling his father he wanted to rest for a while. Sitting on the edge of his bed, he thought about how his life had just fallen apart completely. First, he lost his son. Now it turned out that he had lost his wife and his best friend a long time ago. He just didn't know it. The people closest to him had betrayed him at the worst moment of his life. And the worst thing was that Victoria had talked about freedom on the day of their child's funeral. It was as if David's death was a release from her obligations, not a tragedy. The study was next to the bedroom. Jamal sat in his leather chair, staring at one spot. 15 minutes passed like an eternity. His wife's words echoed in his head. "Now I'm free. David was the only reason I stayed with Jamal. A year and a half. A year and a half of lies, betrayal, fake smiles, and goodnight kisses." His hands trembled with rage. All those months when David was sick, when they sat together in the hospital, holding hands in Dr. Wright's waiting room, praying for their son, she was thinking about Tyrone. While he worked day and night to pay for the best clinics, she was meeting his best friend in hotel rooms. Jamal stood up and walked over to the safe built into the wall behind the painting. His fingers automatically dialed the code, David's date of birth. Inside was the Glock pistol he had bought several years ago to protect his home. The black, cold metal felt alive in his hand. He checked the magazine. It was full. 15 rounds. Jamal never thought he would ever use this weapon, let alone against his own family. But Victoria and Tyrone were no longer his family. They were traitors who had used his grief for their own ends. "David no longer binds us together." His wife's words rang in his head like a death knell. His boy, who just yesterday had been lying in a hospital bed dreaming of a trip to the ocean, was nothing more than an obstacle to his mother's new life. Jamal tucked the gun into his waistband, straightened his jacket, and slowly descended the stairs. The house was still crowded. Muffled voices came from the living room. People were discussing David, remembering his smile, his questions about the big trucks at his father's office. A catering service was working in the kitchen, and guests were filling plates with food in the dining room. Everything looked so peaceful, so normal. No one suspected the drama unfolding in the heart of the master of the house. Jamal stopped in the doorway of the living room and looked around at those present. Victoria sat in an armchair by the window, her mother Dorothy sitting next to her. His wife looked calm, even peaceful, for the first time in days. Jamal's business partners were seated on the sofa opposite. Richard Miller with his wife, Judge William Harris, and Marcus Brown, the owner of a construction company. Victoria's colleagues from the law firm stood by the fireplace. Tyrone stood next to Jamal's father by the bookcase. Robert was telling him something, gesturing with his hands, while Tyrone nodded and smiled. It was the same deceitful smile that Jamal had seen thousands of times before. The smile of his best friend, his son's godfather, a traitor. Jamal took out his gun and raised it, pointing the barrel at the ceiling. "Everyone shut up!" he shouted so loudly that his voice echoed throughout the house. The reaction was instantaneous. The conversation stopped as if on cue. Richard Miller choked on a sip of whiskey and began to cough. Judge Harris's wife screamed and clutched her heart. Dorothy Evans turned pale and grabbed her daughter's hand. "Jamal, what are you doing?" Robert took a step toward his son, but Jamal turned the gun toward him. "Stay where you are, Dad. Don't come any closer." The guests began to slowly retreat toward the walls, some crouching down. Marcus Brown instinctively shielded his wife with his body. Victoria's colleagues from the law firm huddled against a bookcase, one of them already holding a phone in his hand. "Put your phones away!" Jamal barked, waving his gun. "All phones on the floor, now!" Several people reluctantly took out their cell phones and threw them on the carpet. The living room was silent, broken only by the heavy breathing of frightened people. The smell of expensive perfume, coffee, and flowers mixed with the sharp smell of fear. "Jay, calm down." Tyrone took a cautious step forward, raising his hands. "What's going on? Put the gun down." "Shut up!" Jamal turned to his friend, his eyes flashing with rage. "Not a word, Tyrone. Not a single word." "Jamal, dear." Victoria's voice trembled, but she tried to speak calmly. "Put the gun down. You've scared everyone. Think about the guests." "The guests?" Jamal laughed, but it was a broken, hysterical laugh. "You want me to think about the guests, Victoria? How about I think about how my wife has been fucking my best friend for a year and a half?" Several women gasped. Dorothy Evans covered her face with her hands. Judge Harris tried to say something, but Jamal didn't let him open his mouth. "Shut up! Everyone shut up and listen!" He pointed the gun at his wife. "Today, on the day of our son's funeral, I heard my beloved wife tell her lover that she was now free, that David was no longer tied to them, that my boy was the only reason she stayed in this marriage." Victoria turned pale, but tried to protest. "Jamal, you misunderstood." "Misunderstood?" Her husband's voice broke into a scream. "I heard every word. A year and a half, Victoria. A year and a half you lied to my face. You kissed me before bed, told me you loved me while you were planning a new life with Tyrone." The guests huddled against the walls, some crying in horror. Richard Miller slowly moved toward the exit, but Jamal noticed his movement. "Stop! No one leaves until I'm done." He waved his gun and the people froze. "You all came to see my son off on his final journey and at the same time to watch a show, to see how grieving parents support each other." "Jamal, please," Tyrone tried to speak again. "Let's discuss this in private, not in front of everyone." "Not in front of everyone?" Jamal turned to him, his face contorted with rage. "Just like you fucked my wife? Made plans on my grief?" "We didn't want it to turn out this way," Tyrone's voice became pleading. "It just happened. We fell in love." Fell in love. Jamal grabbed his head with his free hand, keeping the gun pointed. "Fell in love? You were my son's godfather. You held him in your arms when he was born. You taught him how to ride a bike, and then you slept with his mother." Several guests began to cry quietly. Marcus Brown's wife sobbed into her handkerchief. Victoria's colleagues looked at each other, not knowing what to do. "Jay, listen." Tyrone took another step forward. "I know how this looks, but we didn't plan to hurt you." "You didn't plan it?" Jamal's voice grew quieter, but there was something frightening in it. "What did you plan? A divorce in a week? A new life on my money? A happy future on the bones of my child?" "That's not true," Victoria finally spoke, jumping up from her chair. "David was my son. I loved him." "Loved him?" Jamal turned to her, demons dancing in his eyes. "You loved him? Then why did you say you were free? That he was the only reason we got married? That now you and Tyrone can be together?" "That's not what I meant." "You're lying!" Jamal's shout drowned out all other sounds. "You lied then, and you're lying now. Tell the truth. In front of everyone. Tell them you're having an affair with Tyrone. Tell them you were planning to divorce me. Tell them that our son's death was a liberation for you." Victoria stood with her mouth open, unable to utter a word. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she remained silent. "Speak!" Jamal pointed the gun directly at her. "Or I'll shoot right now!" "Jamal, don't!" Tyrone rushed forward, trying to get between his friend and Victoria. Jamal spun around and fired. The loud bang deafened everyone in the room. Tyrone screamed and fell, clutching his right leg. Blood began to seep through his fingers. The women screamed. Marcus Brown grabbed his wife and dragged her toward the exit. But Jamal pointed the gun at him again. "Stop," I said. "One more move, and the next bullet will be in your head." The guests froze in terror. Tyrone writhed on the floor, clutching his wound. A red puddle slowly spread across the expensive Persian rug. "Now talk, Victoria." Jamal's voice was calm, but there was death in that calmness. "Tell everyone the truth. About your meetings, about your plans, about what you thought of our son." Victoria stared at her husband with wide eyes. Tyrone writhed on the floor, the guests huddled against the walls in mortal terror. The smell of gunpowder mingled with the smell of blood. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, we're having an affair. For a year and a half. Louder, so everyone can hear." "I'm having an affair with Tyrone," she cried through her tears. "We love each other. We plan to be together." "What about David? What about our son?" Victoria was silent, sobbing. "Answer me." I didn't want to hurt him," she barely managed to say. "But I couldn't live in this marriage anymore. I felt like I was in prison." "In prison?" Jamal's voice broke. "Our marriage was a prison to you? And our son was the guard? That's not what I meant." "Yes, that's exactly what you meant." He moved closer to her, holding the gun at her head. "You told Tyrone that you were free now, that David was no longer tied to you. You were happy that our child was dead." "No," Victoria screamed. "That's not true. I wasn't happy." "You're lying." Jamal was already 3 steps away from her. "You only thought about yourself, about your desires, about your new life. My son was dying and you were making plans with my best friend." The guests watched the scene as if spellbound. No one dared to move. Dorothy Evans cried, praying in a whisper. Judge Harris slowly reached for his phone but was afraid to breathe. "Jamal, please." Victoria raised her hands. "I know I did the wrong thing, but murder won't solve anything. Think of David. He wouldn't want this." "Don't you dare say his name," Jamal roared. "Don't you dare talk about what he wanted. You betrayed his memory. You turned his funeral into a farce." He raised the gun and aimed it at Victoria's head. His hand didn't tremble. His face was stone. "Goodbye, Victoria." "No!" she screamed. The shot rang out like thunder. Victoria collapsed to the floor, blood splattering the wall behind her. The women screamed hysterically. Marcus Brown grabbed his wife and ran for the exit, ignoring Jamal's cries. "Stop!" Jamal aimed his gun at the runners, but they had already disappeared through the door. The remaining guests huddled against the walls, trembling with fear. Several people had fainted. Dorothy Evans sobbed over her daughter's body, not daring to approach. Jamal turned to Tyrone, who was trying to crawl toward the exit, leaving a trail of blood on the carpet. "Now it's your turn," he said calmly, pointing the gun at his wounded friend. "You destroyed my family. You desecrated my son's memory. You betrayed our friendship." "Jamal, don't," Tyrone moaned, trying to stop the bleeding. "I know I deserve to die. But think about yourself. You still have a chance." "A chance for what? To live with memories of betrayal? To think every day about how you laughed at me behind my back?" Jamal pulled the trigger. The room was deathly silent, broken only by the sobs of the guests and Tyrone's moans. "Stop!" A cry rang out from behind him. Jamal turned and saw his father slowly approaching him. "Don't come any closer, Dad, I warned you!" "Son, put the gun down." Robert's voice was firm, but there was a plea in it. "Enough. You already killed Victoria. Don't kill Tyrone. He betrayed me. They both betrayed me. I know, son, I heard everything. They did a despicable thing. But if you kill him, you'll be a murderer of 2 people. David wouldn't want that." "David is dead!" Jamal shouted, turning between his father and Tyrone. "He's dead! And these 2 were planning to dance on his grave. But you're still alive!" Robert took another step forward. "And I don't want to lose another son. Don't come any closer!" Jamal pointed the gun at his father, but he kept coming. "Shoot if you can," the old man said. "But I won't let you take another life." Jamal looked at his father, his eyes filled with rage and pain. Robert stepped closer and placed his hand on the barrel of the gun. "Give it to me, son." "They killed my family," Jamal whispered, tears streaming down his cheeks. "They killed everything I lived for." "I know, but murder won't bring David back. and it won't heal your pain. Jamal looked into his father's eyes and slowly lowered the gun. Robert carefully took the weapon and threw it aside. At that moment, seeing that the threat was over, the guests rushed to the exits. Panic broke out in the house. People jostled at the doors, screaming and crying. Someone had already called the police and an ambulance. A few minutes later, the Clarks' house was empty. Only Jamal, his father, the wounded Tyrone, Victoria's body, and a few close relatives who did not dare to flee remained. Sirens could already be heard in the distance.